The canyon road out of Mineral Fork, Utah Territory, ran west for 11 miles before it hit the dry wash that separated the settled land from the stretch of broken red rock the locals called the Notch. In the spring of 1887, when the snowmelt came fast and the runoff cut new channels through the sandstone, a freight wagon had gone off the switchback road and dropped 40 feet into the narrowest bend of the Notch. The driver had walked away with a broken wrist and a destroyed livelihood. The wagon had not walked anywhere. It had wedged between two angled walls of rock and stayed there, tilting on its near side wheels, its canvas top shredded by the fall, and its load of territorial supply goods scattered down the canyon floor by flash floods over the years that followed. By the summer of 1891, 4 years after the wreck, the wagon sat sun-bleached and rotting, its iron wheel rims gone to rust, its bed warped open at the joints, its tongue snapped and buried in alluvial sand. The County Road Commission had looked at it once, declared the cost of extraction too high for the value of the timber remaining, and closed its file on the matter. The freighting company that had owned it had dissolved the following year, its assets dispersed and its records scattered between 3 different territorial courthouses. Nobody wanted the wagon. Nobody had reason to want it. The county auctioned it on a Thursday morning in July, with 17 other lots of abandoned or unclaimed property. The auctioneer was a man named Boone, thin and sunburned, who had a habit of holding the photograph of each lot at arm's length as he described it, as if the physical distance between himself and the item reinforced the impartiality of his opinion. He held up a tintype photograph of the wagon wreck in the canyon and described it in the flat economy of a man who has described worthless things many times. A covered freight wagon of roughly 18-foot bed length, wood and iron construction. 4 years in a canyon in the Notch, condition unknown beyond the photograph. He paused at the end of the description and looked over the assembled yard, the way a man looks at a room when he already knows the answer to the question he is about to ask. He named the opening bid at $1. There were perhaps 30 people in the yard that morning, a combination of men who bought lots for their salvage value and men who had come in from the basin farms to conduct other business at the courthouse and had stopped to watch. A few of the lot sales had generated real bidding, a pair of draft horses in good condition, and a haymow that an incoming homesteader had bid against a rancher's foreman. The wagon lot was expected to produce nothing and to close quickly on Boone's own estimate of $1. Nora Vess bid $2. If you have ever watched a room full of people reassess a woman in a single moment, you know what happened in the yard of the Mineral Fork County building. On that Thursday morning, there was a pause, and then there was laughter, and the laughter was not cruel so much as baffled. Nora Vess was 26 years old, 5 feet 4 inches in her boots, and she had arrived in Mineral Fork 3 months earlier with a leather tool satchel, a mule named Clement, and $41 to her name. She had spent those 3 months doing repair work on farm equipment and the axle sets of 2 freighting outfits that ran the canyon road regularly, building a modest income and a smaller reputation. She was known at the livery and at the hardware store and at the land office only by the work she had produced, which was precise and reliable. And she was known at the auction yard this morning as a young woman who had apparently just bid $2 for a piece of wreckage in a canyon. A man behind her said something about a long rope. Several others joined the low laughter that went around the yard. Boone looked at her with the expression of a man who is professionally obligated to take every bidder seriously, and who is finding this difficult. He asked once more for other bids. There were none. He closed the lot at $2 and shook his head once in the manner of a man who has discharged his duty and cannot be held responsible for the choices of the people who appeared before him. She paid the $2 at the clerk's table, received her lot receipt, and walked to the livery to get Clement. She had no bids against her. She had not expected any. The man who ran the livery was named Gal, a compact, deliberate man who said what he meant and did not say much else. He had been the one who told her about the wagon 3 weeks earlier, in the course of a conversation about the county's upcoming sale of unclaimed property. He had mentioned it only to dismiss it, saying the county was finally getting rid of that wreck down in the Notch, the one the Kane outfit left when their driver went off the switchback 4 years back. Nora had asked him the name of the freighting company. He told her. She had asked him who made the wagon. He had not known. She had gone that evening to the courthouse and found the road commission's file and spent 20 minutes with the surveyor's notation and the tintype photograph. And in those 20 minutes, she had decided on the $2. The manufacturer was a man named Silas Dray, who had operated a wagon works in Salt Lake City in the late 1870s and early 1880s before his death in 1883. Nora's grandfather, a wagon wright named Cobb Vess, who had built and repaired wagons for 40 years out of his shop in Richfield, 60 miles to the south, had known Silas Dray personally. He had spoken of him with the particular admiration that craftsmen reserve for other craftsmen who have solved a difficult problem well. He had described the wagons Dray produced, the quality of the joinery, the material choices, the specific innovations that made Dray's heavy freighting wagons among the finest in the territory. And he had told Nora, in the concrete way he told her everything that mattered, about the one feature that set Dray's best work apart from any other wagon builder she would encounter in her working life. Cobb Vess had died in the winter of 1889 in his shop in Richfield, at the workbench, of a failure of the heart. He had left Nora the tools and the knowledge of how to use them and the habit, formed over a lifetime of watching him work, of looking at a thing other people had given up on, and asking with genuine curiosity what remained of value inside it. The tools included one that he had made himself, from a clock spring flattened and fitted to a wooden handle, a thin pin wrench of a very specific gauge. He had made it the winter after he first worked on a Silas Dray wagon, and he had kept it in its own cloth sleeve at the side of the satchel. Nora had asked him once why he kept a tool for a wagon he had encountered only once. He had told her that a tool for a specific lock was worth keeping because the lock would appear again, and that the day she needed it, she would be glad to have it. She had been glad. The morning after the auction, she drove Clement out along the canyon road with a coil of half-inch hemp rope, a block and tackle rig she had assembled from hardware she purchased at the general goods store the previous afternoon, and the satchel. The road commission's file had named the location precisely, and she found the place without difficulty. The guard log at the switchback had been replaced at some point in the intervening years, and she stood at the canyon rim and looked down into the Notch. The canyon walls angled inward at roughly 30 degrees, and in the narrowest bend, 40 feet below, the wagon sat wedged tight. The near side wheels rested on a ledge of sandstone, and the far side leaned against the canyon wall at a 5-degree tilt. The sun came in at a steep angle from the east and lit the bed of the wagon in warm, raking light that caught the orange-red rust on the iron hardware and the pale, dried grain of the walnut boards. Even from 40 feet up, she could see that the bed was intact. The sideboards had warped, and one had sprung at its lower fastener, but the floor planks ran straight and unbroken from one end to the other. She tied one end of the rope to Clement's neck collar and the other to the sandstone outcrop at the switchback that she had selected as her anchor, tested the load tolerance, and climbed down on the free line she had rigged for herself. The canyon air was cooler than the road by 20 degrees. It smelled of dry iron and fine sand and something else underneath, faint and organic, the long decomposition of the canvas top that lay in pale strips against the base of the far canyon wall, sun-bleached to the color of old bone. She moved carefully on the sandstone ledge, testing each footfall before she trusted it, and came to the wagon from the tongue end. The tongue was snapped at the coupling bolt, as the road commission file had noted, and buried in 4 years of wind-blown alluvial sand to a depth of perhaps 8 inches. She knelt and felt the end of it, running her fingers along the fractured wood to confirm the break was clean and not the result of rot in the timber. It was clean. The grain was still sound at the fracture. She walked the full length of the bed with her hand on the near side rail and tapped every floor plank with the heel of her hand, listening to the sound each one returned. The canyon was quiet enough that the difference between a plank seated solidly on its joists and a plank that was floating was audible as well as tactile. A slight shift in resonance, a half beat of hollow beneath the knock. The floor planks were walnut. Cobb had told her that Silas Dre used walnut for his freight floors because walnut did not check and cup the way pine or cottonwood did through the cycles of dry heat and rare rain that the territory put timber through. The planks had warped slightly at their edges where weather had reached them over the years, but across the center of the bed, they were tight-grained and sound, the figure of the wood still visible under the fine dust coating. She pulled the sand out of the front corner joints with her fingers and examined the mortise work. The joinery was the finest she had seen outside her grandfather's own shop. The iron hardware at the corner posts was hand-forged, the shoulders of each bolt head square, and even in a way that told her they had been made by a smith who understood what the hardware would be asked to bear. She worked her way to the center of the bed and got down on her hands and knees on the walnut planks. The sun was still low, and the raking light fell at almost a horizontal angle through the gap between the canyon walls, and in that light she could see the surface grain of every board clearly. She pressed her palm flat against the third plank from the near side, 4 feet back from the front board, and felt what she had hoped to feel. A slight differential in flex, no more than a fraction of an inch of give in the surface when she pressed, but present and unmistakable. The plank was floating, not loose at its ends, not failed at its joint. Floating in the specific way of a plank that has nothing beneath it but air. She did not allow herself to name aloud what she believed she was looking at. That was a rule Cobb had given her plainly. Do not name the contents of a sealed thing until you have opened it honestly. She went to work on the front board. The front board of the wagon was a full 2-inch walnut plank, face-jointed at each end to the corner posts, with a decorative routed channel along its upper edge. The channel was 3/8 of an inch wide and ran the full length of the board. Nora studied it for 3 minutes, running her thumb along the full length at a slow, even pace, before she found the access point. There was a section of the channel approximately 2 inches wide, located 7 inches from the right corner post, where the routing stopped 1/16 of an inch shallower than the rest of the channel. The difference was not visible to the eye. It was only felt. She had felt it in 2 other dray wagons in her life, both times at her grandfather's side while he pointed it out to her. And she had not expected to find it in a third, not here, not in a wrecked wagon at the bottom of a Utah canyon. But here it was. She took the pin wrench from its cloth sleeve in the satchel, set the thin blade into the shallow section of the channel, and applied 1/4 turn of pressure to the right. The front board shifted inward, a hair's breadth at its center. The locking pin was spring-loaded, Cobb had told her, and it required the inward pressure of a palm to disengage fully. She pressed the front board firmly with her left palm while she completed the quarter turn, felt the click transfer through the board and through her palm and up her wrist, and the false floor released. The forward section of the wagon bed lifted as a unit when she pulled on the front board, pivoting on 2 sets of hidden hinges set at the far edge of the section. It was heavy, 40 pounds of walnut planking at minimum, and she braced her right shoulder against the front wheel hub and held it open and looked inside. The compartment was approximately 3 feet deep, 3 feet from front to back, and the full 62-inch width of the wagon bed. It had been lined in oiled canvas at the time of manufacture, and the canvas had darkened and cracked along its lower edges, but held its integrity across the walls and the floor beneath. The compartment was dry. The canyon had protected it from direct rain, and the angled canyon walls had redirected the flash floods that had stripped the wagon's cargo in previous years. And the sealed false floor had kept out the fine red dust that had drifted into every exposed surface of the wagon. There was a faint smell of cedar from the planking in the walls and of old canvas, and nothing else. Everything inside the compartment was as the person who placed it there had left it, sometime in the spring of 1887, before the wagon went off the switchback road. In the compartment there were 6 items. There was a tin dispatch box fastened with a common hasp lock. There was a canvas roll of papers tied with waxed cord, still intact. There was a leather wallet, flat and cracked, folded once. There were 2 sealed glass bottles of the type used by assayers for core samples, their paper labels intact and legible. And there was a surveyor's field notebook in an oilcloth cover, wrapped in a second piece of oilcloth, tied with the same waxed cord used on the papers. Nora held the compartment open with her shoulder and looked at each item for a full minute without touching anything. Then she lowered the false floor gently until she heard the lock re-engage, and she climbed back up to the road. She returned to Mineral Fork in the late afternoon and put Clement up at Xel's livery and paid the night fee and walked to her rented room above the hardware store. She ate what was in her kit and then sat at the small table by the window and cleaned each tool in the satchel in order, working through them slowly, the way her grandfather had taught her to clean tools after a day's work, regardless of whether they had been used, with a rag, a light oil, and the attention the tool deserved for what it was built to do. She cleaned the pin wrench last. When she had finished, she set it in its cloth sleeve and folded the sleeve over and set it back in its position at the side of the satchel. Then she lay down on the cot. She did not sleep well. The question of extraction occupied most of her attention, because there was no point in thinking about the compartment's contents until she had the wagon out of the canyon and on level ground, where she could work with the documents in proper light. She ran the extraction problem through its stages in order, anchor positions and load calculations, and the 2-stage rig she would need to clear the near side wheels from the ledge without losing the angle, the probable behavior of corroded axle bolts under a lateral load, the risk of the bed seam giving way at the critical moment of the lift when the full weight would bear on the forward section. The full weight on the forward section, which was heavier than it appeared. She had cataloged that weight when she pressed on the floating plank. She understood it precisely. By the time the moon cleared the canyon rim, she had the problem solved to her satisfaction, and she slept. The following morning, she went to the livery before Gall had finished his first coffee and told him she needed to hire a strong man for 2 days' canyon work. Gall looked at her with the expression of a man who has been asked surprising things and has learned to stop showing it, and he mentioned Harv Peel, who had been in the auction yard. He said Harv Peel was available and capable and would do what he was told, which was what she needed to know. She walked to the address Gall gave her and found Harv Peel on his porch with a cup of coffee and a face that went very still when he saw who was at his gate. He was a broad-backed man in his 40s, a former hard rock miner who had gone independent after a shaft collapse at the Emery County Silver Works had convinced him that underground labor was a young man's work. He did odd jobs with the equanimity of a man who has survived worse. She told him the work and the pay, and he asked 3 practical questions about the rig and the anchor points. She answered all 3 precisely. He said he would be at the livery at first light. They worked through 2 full days. The first was rigging. She mapped the load points above the canyon rim, selected 3 anchor positions in the sandstone, and built a 2-stage block and tackle arrangement that would bring the wagon up whole if the bed held its structural integrity on the lift, or in sections if it did not. Harv Peel set anchors where she directed him without commentary, and pulled line when she asked him to pull it, and at the end of the day he said nothing about the auction, and she said nothing about it either. The second day was the lift, beginning at first light. The wheel rims were corroded along their outer faces but still seated in their hubs, and the axle bolts held when she tested them with a bar. She had greased the hub faces the previous evening with a tallow she carried in a tin for exactly this purpose. The wagon came off the ledge on the second attempt, the first attempt having been a learning pass to read how the load wanted to move. And when it left the sandstone ledge, it pendulated once against the canyon wall before she and Harv Peel steadied the lines from above. It rose in a slow, controlled arc, the bed creaking at one of the sideboard seams but the floor planks holding fast. And when the near side wheels cleared the canyon rim, she set the rear pins and took the full weight on the anchor. They had the wagon fully on level ground before noon. Harv Peel looked at the wagon for a moment, its wheel rims rust brown and its canvas gone entirely and its walnut planking pale as driftwood in the sun, and he said it was worth more than $2. She told him that was likely true, and paid him his wage and the percentage she had promised. She moved the wagon to the back lot she had rented from the hardware man, and worked alone through the afternoon. The items in the false compartment were as she had left them. She removed each one and set it on the tailgate in order, and opened each in sequence, in the full horizontal light of the afternoon sun. The tin dispatch box held coin. $140 in assorted silver denomination, wrapped in a cloth that had dried and contracted around the coins over 4 years. The coin was sound. She set it aside and did not count it twice. The canvas roll of papers held 3 documents. The first was a deed, executed in the autumn of 1879, conveying 220 acres in the Mineral Fork Basin, described by a surveyor's meets and bounds description with name landmarks and section references from a man named Porter Alcott to a man named Henrik Lund. Both signatures were present, properly witnessed by 2 named parties, with a territorial notary's seal affixed to the lower left corner. The ink was brown with age, but legible in every word. The second document was a promissory note dated the same week as the deed, in which Henrik Lund acknowledged receipt of $400 from Porter Alcott, the sum representing the seller's retained consideration for a water easement crossing the conveyed parcel at its southern boundary. The third was a surveyor's certificate, signed and sealed by a licensed territorial surveyor, confirming the easement boundaries precisely and attesting that they matched the description in the promissory note in every particular. The leather wallet held a single folded letter. The letter was from a Salt Lake City law firm, addressed to Henrik Lund at a Mineral Fork address, dated 1881, 2 years after the deed of sale. The letter stated that a competing deed claim had been filed against the same 220 acres by the Alcott Land and Mineral Company, a corporation incorporated in the Utah Territory in 1880. The letter advanced the legal position that the corporate deed would supersede Lund's individual deed under a specific provision of territorial land law, and that Lund's most practical course was to accept a settlement of $40 for the parcel and surrender his deed voluntarily within 30 days. The letter closed with the standard courtesy language of a firm that understands itself to be conducting legitimate business. The 2 sealed assayer's bottles held core samples, each labeled in pencil on paper tags, tied carefully around the bottle's neck. The labels matched a grid reference system that Nora did not immediately understand, but which she recognized as matching the coordinate notation in the surveyor's field notebook. She set the bottles beside the notebook and opened the notebook last. The field notebook was 43 pages of survey work, all dated between the autumn of 1879 and the spring of 1880, all referencing the same 220 acres that had been conveyed to Henrik Lund. The first 25 pages were standard boundary and topographic survey work, methodical and clearly recorded. The final 18 pages were different in character from the first, each entry more deliberate than the last, the handwriting tighter and more careful, the grid references more precise. The author had been finding something that changed what he thought he was recording. The core samples cross-referenced to these later pages. The grid they described when she laid out the coordinate pattern on the tailgate with a pencil and a blank page from her own kit showed a pattern of subsurface water sources that the surveyor had identified and marked with increasing precision across those final 18 pages. The word he used for the pattern was artesian. He wrote it plainly without emphasis, as a man writes a word he has been trained to recognize and knows the practical weight of. Nora sat on the tailgate for a long time after she finished reading the notebook. Porter Alcott had sold Henrik Lund 220 acres of land and a water easement in 1879. The sale had been honest in its structure, both parties signing and a notary sealing the deed, and the price was fair by the standard of the time and the land. The survey work had been completed the previous season as part of Alcott's own assessment of the parcel before he sold it. The final 18 pages of the survey notebook and the core samples had been the result of survey work completed after the sale was concluded. Alcott had sent his surveyor back to the parcel after the deed was signed, for reasons the notebook did not record, but that were not difficult to understand given what the surveyor had found there. An artesian zone of significant yield, confirmed by core samples under a section of the land that the water easement crossed, made the 220 acres a different order of property than what Alcott had thought he was selling. It made the water easement, retained by the seller at the buyer's expense, worth considerably more than the $400 Lund had paid for it. The Alcott Land and Mineral Company had been incorporated the following year. The competing deed claim had been filed 2 months after that. The law firm's letter had threatened Lund with a legal argument strong enough to produce a territorial court ruling against his deed, and the survey notebook and the assayer's core samples, which would have established that Lund's deed was both valid and of far greater value than Alcott's settlement offer admitted, had been loaded onto a freight wagon bound for Cedar City in the spring of 1887, most likely for delivery to a lawyer or a land office recorder, and the wagon had gone off the switchback that same afternoon. Alcott had not needed to do anything further. The evidence had simply ceased to exist, as far as he knew, at the bottom of a canyon. She folded each document carefully and wrapped the packages in clean cloth from her kit. The compartment had held them for 4 years in good condition, and they would survive travel in her satchel. She placed the wrapped packages inside, alongside the pin wrench, and closed the satchel. She went the following morning to the Mineral Fork Land Office and asked to see the claim file on the Alcott Land and Mineral Company. Tully, the young clerk who had been in the auction yard, looked at her with the particular mixture of uncertainty and reflex dismissal she'd come to read accurately in 3 months of working in Mineral Fork. He went to the shelves and returned with the file and set it on the counter without ceremony. She read it in 20 minutes. The corporate deed claim had been filed in 1881 and had sat in formal dispute since, unresolved, because Henrik Lund had refused to surrender and the Alcott Company had not brought the matter to territorial court. A notation from 1888, the year after the wagon went off the road, read simply, "No further activity on claim. Status dormant. Dormant." The claim had sat dormant for 3 years because the evidence that would have settled it one way or the other had been sitting in a false floor 40 feet down in the notch. She asked Tully whether Henrik Lund was still living in the basin. Tully told her with genuine surprise that Lund's widow and son still ran the original parcel and had run it for 9 years with the title clouded, unable to sell and unable to borrow against the land because no bank in the territory would extend credit on a deed under active dispute. The widow's name was Marta Lund. The son was named Carl. Nora thanked him and walked out. The road to the Lund parcel was 6 miles east of town on a creek drainage that branched off the main canyon road. She drove Clement at a steady pace and arrived in the middle of the morning. The homestead was modest and well kept. The kitchen garden tended in straight rows, the barn roof recently reshingled on the south face, the fence lines repaired and tight. The marks of careful, continuous work were visible everywhere on the property, the kind of work that people do when they are determined not to let a thing they have built be taken from them by someone who never built anything. Marta Lund came out of the barn when she heard Clement on the drive, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a woman in her mid-50s with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back under her work cap and hands that showed 30 years of outdoor labor. She had the wariness of a woman who had received mostly difficult news from strangers over the course of 9 years, and she stood at the barn door with that wariness in her face and waited for Nora to speak. Carl came out behind his mother a moment later, a young man of perhaps 20, tall and careful-eyed, who positioned himself slightly to his mother's left in the quiet way of a man who has learned to stand between his family and what comes up the drive. Nora introduced herself by name and trade. She set the satchel on the tailgate of the salvage wagon and removed the wrapped packages one by one and laid them on the worn boards in the morning light. She said she had recovered items from the wrecked cane freight wagon that had been in the notch for 4 years, and that among those items were documents that appeared to belong to the estate of Henrik Lund, and that she wanted to be certain they reached the right hands. Marta Lund looked at the deed with her husband's name on it for a long time before she touched it. Carl read over her shoulder in silence. The kitchen garden was visible past the corner of the barn, green and orderly, and the creek ran somewhere beyond the far fence with the sound of late summer water, reduced and deliberate. When Marta Lund finally touched the deed, she touched it with 2 fingers at its corner, very carefully, as if verifying that it was made of something real. She said, "Where?" Nora told her from the beginning the full account of it, the auction yard and the $2, the morning in the canyon, the false floor and the mechanism and the compartment, and then each document in order, what it was and what she understood it to mean. Marta Lund listened without interrupting. Her eyes stayed on the deed most of the time, moving once to the surveyor's notebook and once to the law firm's letter, and then returning to the deed. When Nora finished, she waited. "He always said the papers were sent ahead," Marta said. Her voice was level, the flatness of a woman who has held a difficult thing steady for a long time. The morning before the accident, he said the driver was to take them to the territorial recorder at Cedar City. We never learned what happened to them after the wagon went off. "They did not reach Cedar City," Nora said. Marta Lund looked at the deed once more and then at Nora. "Did you know what was inside before you bought it?" "I believe there was a concealed compartment," Nora said. "I did not know what it held." What the surveyor's field notebook accomplished in practical terms. When Nora presented the full set of documents at the Mineral Fork Land Office the following week with Marta Lund and Carl Lund present, and a territorial attorney engaged in Cedar City present by written authority, was to remove every legal basis for the Alcott Land and Mineral Company's competing claim. The original deed was properly executed and notarized. The competing claim rested on a legal argument that had never been tested in court because Henrik Lund had refused to surrender voluntarily and the Alcotts had not pressed their case likely because they understood that the survey evidence documenting the artesian zone's true value was missing from the public record, and they had no way of knowing where it had gone. The core samples established the zone's yield. The promissory note established the honest terms of the easement. Together, they made the Alcott corporate claim not merely legally weaker than the original deed, but administratively insupportable. The Alcott Land and Mineral Company had dissolved in 1889, 2 years after the Wagon went off the road, its principals having moved on to other enterprises. Porter Alcott himself had died in Salt Lake City in 1890. His estate had been settled among his heirs. There was no one present to contest the documents or advance the competing claim, and the land agent, reviewing the full file and the recovered materials, voided the corporate deed claim as unsupported on the merits after 3 weeks and 2 formal filings, and 1 letter from the territorial attorney in Cedar City. The cloud on the Lund title was cleared. Tully recorded the final notation in the claim file on a Tuesday morning in late August of 1891, his pen moving in careful strokes. Nora sat across the counter and watched him complete it. The $140 in silver she turned over to Marta Lund as well, on the grounds that it had been in the possession of her husband's freight consignment when it was lost and reasonably belonged to his estate. The wooden wagon she stripped for its sound hardware and its walnut planking, which she sold to a cabinet maker in Cedar City for $22. She paid Harv Peel what she still owed him from the salvage proceeds and kept nothing of the coin. The tools her grandfather had made went back into the satchel, each in its proper place. There is a thing that happens to people who have held a disputed land title for 9 years, clouded by a claim they knew was wrong but could not disprove, while they worked the land and repaired the barn roof and kept the kitchen garden in straight rows and borrowed against nothing because no bank would lend. When the cloud is lifted, it does not announce itself with ceremony. It arrives in the form of a clerk's notation and a land agent's signature and a letter that says the file is closed. What changes is not the land, or the house, or the fence lines. What changes is the weight of the thing they have been carrying, and they do not notice the weight is gone until they reach for it in the morning and find it absent. Marta Lund wrote Nora a letter after the file was closed, and Nora kept it in the satchel between the pin wrench and the mortise gauge through the years of work that followed. She was in Mineral Fork through the winter of 1891 and into 1892, then took contract work in the Sanpete Valley, and later along the Green River freighting routes. The work was steady and it was good work. She was known, in the way that craftspeople come to be known in a territory that has use for skilled hands, as someone who could read what had failed in a working thing and determine what remained sound and what was beyond salvage, and the reputation was enough to keep her moving forward on her own terms. Years later, the cabinet maker in Cedar City, who bought the walnut planking, told a customer that it was the finest freight timber he had ever worked with, and that it had come out of a Silas dray wagon, pulled from a canyon by a woman who had paid $2 for the lot at county auction, while a yard full of men laughed. The customer asked what the woman's name was. The cabinet maker thought for a moment and said he couldn't recall the name precisely, but that he remembered her tools and the way she handled them and the fact that she had seemed entirely unsurprised by what the wagon had contained, as if she had known what to look for and where to look, long before she ever set foot in the canyon. The pin wrench her grandfather had made from a clock spring and a wooden handle sat in its cloth sleeve in the satchel throughout all of it. It was not much to look at, but it had opened the one lock in the territory that no other tool could have found, and what had come out of that locked space had been more than timber and hardware and silver coin. It had been 9 years of a family's honest claim, finally resolved in favor of those who had worked the land faithfully and asked for nothing beyond what they had been sold and paid for. She drove east along the canyon road in the early autumn of 1892, Clement at a good steady walk, the red rock lit amber by the low sun behind her. She did not look back at the place where the wagon had gone off the switchback, because there was no longer any reason to. The thing that had needed to come up from that canyon had come up, carried by a steady hand and a dead man's tools, and a woman who understood that the work was the point, and that patience was the only instrument equal to the weight of what was buried. She had other work waiting. She went to do it, too.